7 p.m. We will start. Good evening once again, friends. Welcome once again to HLF online session. And on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinara Murthy, and on my own behalf, I welcome you once again to another online session of HLF. Before we start today's session, I would like to make a couple of announcements. With this session, today's session, we are going live and we are available only on the YouTube channel, HLF YouTube channel. And therefore, I request you to subscribe to our channel and also click on the bell icon so that every time we have an event, you get a notification. The second announcement that I want to make is please do type in your questions in the chat box. And after the conversation, I'll ask those questions on your behalf. And the third announcement that I wanted to make is about the next event, which is in 15 days time. As you know, we are doing this once in 15 days. The next session on the 21st of August will be a conversation with Sherry Simon from Concordia University, and she will be speaking to us on her recent book, Translation Sites, a Field Guide. So that would be on the 21st of August, again at 7 p.m. So for today's session, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Priyamwada Gopal. Dr. Priyamvada Gopal is familiar to many of us through her earlier work, particularly her work on the Indian novel and the earlier book on the Progressive Writers Association. And today, of course, we will be speaking with her about her latest book, The Insurgent Empire. Before I introduce the book to you, I hope to introduce the book to you because it's not very easy to summarize a 600-odd page book in a couple of sentences, but I'll try my best. For those of you who have not had a chance to read about the book or read through this short summary that we gave in the invite, I would like to mention that Insurgent Empire offers us a counter narrative to the mythology of the empire. It covers a time span of 100 years, roughly, beginning with 1857, the Indian Uprising, and then the last chapter takes us to Kenya, the Mau Mau movement in the 1950s. In these 100 years, what Priyamwada Gopal offers us basically two major arguments. One is that the enterprise of the empire was something that was resisted from the very beginning in the colonies. And it was not as if the independence of the colonies was a kind of a very orderly constitutional process, nor was it a kind of a gift of the British Empire, nor an act of munificence on part of the empire to kind of a proof of their good intentions or their fair play. The book argues that the decolonization process in the colonies is the result of consistent resistance movements in the colonies, and the independence was very much the result of the active agency of the people in the colonies. That's point number one. Point number two is that these movements in the colonies, the resistance movements in the colonies, actually influenced and strengthened the arguments of the critics of the empire back in the metropolitan center. Basically, these are the two arguments, and what the book does is, I cannot do better than read a very quick quotation from the book, which I thought, extremely beautifully summarizes the book. What the book does is that it tracks the ways in which British dissent and criticism on imperial questions over a century were shaped by three factors. One, crises of conscience following bloodshed and repression in the colonies. And two, by travels to areas of unrest that unsettled and reshaped received ideas about reform. And three, it was also influenced by the pedagogical work of anti-colonial campaigners and intellectuals in the metropolitan center. So these are the three ways in which the opinion and of the critics of empire, the dissidents of empire were influenced. So I hope I did not get you wrong there, Priya.
That was very deft summary. Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Priya, and welcome once again to HLF. And I would want you to begin at the very beginning to tell us about the genesis, if not of this book, or at least the genesis of the path your work took, which finally kind of ended in this book. So could you tell us how this book actually germinated?
Yeah, my work has really largely been on dissent. So my first book, Literary Radicalism in India, was about, as you said, the progressive writers movement and the ways in which they questioned the project of nation as it was unfolding in the dominant imagination. And they, in a sense, they were sympathetic to the vision of post-colonial nation, but they also posited themselves as critics who had concerns about the direction that the new nations, the two new nations, were taking. And of course, in many ways, some of their concerns have in fact been borne out in the present. But that was a book about dissent. And this book, which moves away from the subcontinent and brings us to Britain, picks up on the theme of dissent. It works again with the idea of people who position themselves as critics within nation formations, but it looks at a slightly different history. It looks at the century of the kind of height of the British Empire, and that includes the British Raj, but not just the British Raj. And it also, I think it tries to do something different in the sense that it tries to give a sense of the relationship between dissidents in particular nations and dissidents in other nations. In other words, a kind of global transnational network of dissidents. And I argue that dissidents have the capacity to, and do in fact, influence each other. So dissidents in different countries actually learn from each other and shape their dissidents in relation to what other people are doing.
In the sort of preface to the book, you also refer to a particularly hot debate that you had on BBC, which in a way set you off on this path. So do tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been for at least about 15 years now engaged in the debate, such as it is, around the empire in Britain. And much of it has been in the public sphere and in newspapers, on television programs, and so on. And one of the things that I realized quite early on, in I think it was 2006, is that most British ordinary people didn't actually have access to an understanding of empire that wasn't completely mythological, completely rooted in a very simplistic understanding of the empire as a benevolent project, which was really about Britain going out into the world and offering the gifts of the railways and the English language and the parliamentary system. And I would say that mythology is still very much embedded in the British political and public sphere. And so I suppose the book, and there was one particular moment I talk about in the book, which was a debate on the BBC, where it was very clear that the BBC's own line was very similar to the kind of mythological line that I'm talking about. And so in some ways, I think that is the point at which I started thinking about how might one do a counter history of empire. But I didn't want to just produce a kind of, okay, you know, here's the critical side of empire. I mean, historians have done that. It's not that that doesn't exist. But I wanted kind of British readers, particularly young British readers, to have a sense not just of the critical history of empire, but also to understand that their own nation and their own history gives them access to people and views that are much more critical of empire than what they get in the British public sphere now. The history of British dissidence on empire has been more or less swept under the carpet, and I wanted to bring that to light.
Yeah, in the 100 years of the history of dissidents that you write about, both in the colonies as well as back in the center, you obviously are not writing a chronological history of the empire, and you pick certain moments, significant moments in the history of the empire to highlight certain points. And you begin with 1857 uprising in India, variously called either mutiny or the First War of Independence. And so you begin with 1857 and you end with the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. So in your selection of these movements, what went into that selection? What movements did you choose? Because it's not as if 1857 happened for the first time. You know, there were the Bhils, uprising, and then there was a Vellore mutiny, and so there was the Polygars mutiny, and so on and so forth. So, in what way does 1857 mark a significant moment for you to begin there?
Okay. In one sense, beginning in 1857 is arbitrary, right? So I, in fact, started the work looking at slave rebellions, and I still have that work sitting on my computer, and I intend to go back to it at some point. But I decided at one point that the project was getting out of hand, and I could really only reasonably do a 100-year span. And 1857, I would say, is the first major rebellion that registers on the British public sphere. So it's not that there aren't other rebellions, that there certainly are, but they don't have this kind of reach that 1857 has. 1857, as I explain in the book, really creates a huge public crisis in the British public sphere. It becomes a kind of shared nightmare. It becomes a kind of shared point of trauma and grief. And this has been written about quite extensively, the fact that 1857 was a kind of shared national trauma. But I wanted to ask why it became a shared national trauma, and therefore what it is about 1857 that has a particular significance in the British imagination, and what the consequences of that significance was for dissidents on the question of empire. And I do think it's one of the big moments in British history which kicks off the strain of criticism of the empire within Britain.
So in a way, what you are saying is that your selection of movements has to do as much with the importance of those movements in the colonies as their impact on the dissidents back home.
Yes, but I don't want to say that 1857 was more important than, say, the Birsa Munda uprising. I'm actually saying that 1857 was obviously significant in scale.
Right.
It covered a much larger area, and it covered many more interest groups than some of the previous rebellions. I think of the Indigo Rebellion earlier in the century, for instance. But those rebellions did not have the impact on the public sphere in Britain that 1857 did. And that's, of course, partly because of scale, but also partly because of the ferocity of violence on both sides, the ferocity of the counterinsurgency as much as anything else.
Speaking of ferocity and the violence, your book ends with the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. So if we skip the other important moments that you talk about, tell us about what is your take on the Mau Mau and how significant it was for the British Empire and its own view of the empire.
So Mau Mau I picked because I partly wanted to end on the era of decolonization. And the story of decolonization, I think, has been much too caught up in the Indian model. So that, there is this idea that decolonization was basically a very smooth and peaceful transfer of power from the British ruling classes to the Indian nationalist government. And I think that that is misleading on two scores. For one thing, the Gandhian Indian National Congress model is not the only form of resistance to empire that took place even on the Indian subcontinent. But Mau Mau is an instance of how violent decolonization was. It was not all about civil disobedience and non-cooperation, although Kenya also has many instances of non-violent mobilization. But Mau Mau really represents the point at which attempts to get the British Empire there to listen, to respond, to offer concessions, to make transformations completely failed. And so what you have is that the movement or sections of the anti-colonial movement in Kenya turning to violence, turning to guerrilla warfare. And that is something that actually does need to be acknowledged and brought back into the historical telling of how empire ended. It was a mixture of non-violent resistance and violence. And that violence, again, like 1857, caused controversy and crisis back in Britain. And I would certainly go so far as to say that it sped up decolonization in the African continent.
Yeah, for those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with Mau Mau, Mau Mau was an armed rebellion in the 1950s in Kenya. And although it was suppressed militarily in about 2 to 3 years, it has had a tremendous impact on the Kenyan politics and continues to be an extremely emotive issue even after independence. And of course, the very word Mau Mau has no meaning in any African language. It's a mystery how that name came to be attached to that movement. But Priya, apart from important moments in history, your book also has a gallery of very interesting and very often minor in the mainstream characters who contributed to our understanding of the empire and so on. There are many interesting characters that you talk about, the Chartist Ernest Jones or CLR James or George Padmore, etc. But I would like you to tell us a little bit more about two characters, because to me, they represent two opposite directions. One is Wilfred Blunt, and the second one is Shapurji Saklatwala. Because Wilfred Blunt goes from the in a way, center to the margins, and his ideas are changed. And Saklatwala, in a way, comes from India and becomes an MP in Britain. So do tell us about these two characters.
That's a very nice way of putting it. They have kind of reverse journeys in one sense. Wilfred Blunt is a kind of minor aristocrat born to a reasonably well-off family. He develops a passion for Arabian horses, and he and his wife travel several times to the Middle East to buy horses. And in the process, he becomes very involved and engaged with Islam, and starts to kind of read up and think about Islam and learn Arabic. But he also witnesses the unfolding of the 1882 rebellion in Egypt, the so-called Arabi Rebellion, which was a kind of peasant uprising led by soldiers, or a soldier uprising which was connected to peasant discontent in the country. And Blunt's life trajectory sees him go from being a kind of British imperial patriot to becoming someone who describes himself as an Egyptian in his affiliations and sympathies. And he actually ends up rejecting for a while his Britishness. And he says that I completely throw my lot in with the Egyptian people. I love Egypt. Egypt is my nation. And he becomes one of Britain's not very well known, but very well connected and very articulate anti-imperialists. Shahpurji Saklatwala comes from India to England. He's related to the Tata family. He's a kind of poor relation of the Tata family. Comes to England at a young age, ostensibly to recover from tuberculosis and very sort of pulmonary complaints. He becomes politically involved quite quickly, joins the Liberal Party, and then what was known for a while as the Independent Labour Party, and then eventually the Labour Party. And by 1919, after the Bolshevik Revolution, becomes a communist. And he actually stands for election, and he serves in the British Parliament. So he is the third MP of Indian and, as it happens, of Parsi descent in Britain, alongside Mancher Chand Bhavnagri and obviously Dadabhai Naoroji. And Saklatwala spends his time kind of crafting this really interesting dual identity as simultaneously Indian and British. And he also tries to do something that I think is very important, which is try to get ordinary Indians and ordinary British people to learn from and listen to each other. So he's the first kind of instance of a kind of hyphenated identity within the British Asian community, and someone who crafts a very powerful anti-colonial stance while serving in the British Parliament, in the House of Commons, and as a politician.
And the third character, interestingly, is somebody that I want you to tell us a little bit more about, is somebody who, in a way, is different from these two. She does not move from anywhere to anywhere, but also because she's a woman, and she remains in Britain, and yet becomes part of this resistance movement. And this is Nancy Cunard.
Yeah.
And so, and also probably because, our audience may be interested that her name was also associated with Krishna Menon. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about who was Nancy Cunard and why is she important?
Nancy Cunard is a poet and artist who, again, was a descendant of one of the poorer wings of the Kunard family, which ran a shipping line. And Cunard is somebody who in the West is thought of as a kind of a relatively minor modernist, and she studied in the context of modernist art and poetry. But she became, partly through her contact with Black intellectuals and Asian intellectuals and campaigners who were based in London, she is somebody who becomes an anti-colonialist as well. Doesn't come from a natural background for that kind of thing, but becomes very, very closely involved, particularly with Black intellectuals like George Padmore. She spends time in Paris, where she gets involved with the jazz music scene, which has numerous Black, particularly African American artists involved. And she kind of sets herself up as a facilitator of anti-colonialism, as somebody who uses her cultural capital and what kind of financial means she does have in order to bring Black voices to the European to European audiences and again to the British public sphere. And she develops in particular an alliance. She knows Saklatwala, and she is part of the wider kind of left-wing circles in London. But she develops a particularly interesting friendship and alliance with George Padmore. George Padmore is a campaigner, writer, activist, intellectual who comes to London from Trinidad. And he becomes a very important voice in articulating the experience of colonialism and resistance to colonialism in London on behalf of Africa and the West Indies. And Padmore and Cunard collaborate on writing projects, and they put together a particularly interesting pamphlet. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's called The White Man's Duty, or The White Man's Other Burden. And they talk really about some of the hypocrisies in emergent discourse. What is the word for it? On the emergent international rights discourse, where self-determination and human rights are something that are seen as applicable to the Western countries, but not to the colonies. And I talk about this as a kind of very productive friendship and a really good example of alliances across racial lines that emerge in the era, in the high point of anti-colonialism between the First World War and the Second World War.
Did she not also edit a book of Negro writing?
She does, yes. She edits an amazing anthology called Negro, which brings together Black writers and Black voices and accounts of Black experiences from across the world. So not just Africa, but the United States, Canada, Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond. And what she does is to say that really, in order for the West to understand what is going on, it needs to listen. And it needs to listen to a heterogeneous Black perspective on empire and beyond. I mean, in a way, she's a kind of precursor of Black Lives Matter by putting together voices, radical voices of Black people explaining and asserting themselves and making claims to shared humanity. So Negro, I think, is a very important collection in the annals of anti-colonialism and anti-racism.
Interestingly, what you said about that the empire needs to learn from its colonies is a very interesting idea that you give a beautiful phrase, use a beautiful phrase, reverse tutelage. And to what Achebe earlier called reversing the telescope, because I think one of the important models of colonialism is the model of the center and the periphery, and the movement is always from the center to the periphery, and similarly with ideas, notions, etc. But what you are suggesting in the book is that that ideas also came from the margins to the center, and not just the raw materials but also notions and ideas came from the margins to the center and influenced them. So do tell us about this, particularly in relation to the Jamaica uprising. What are these notions that were considered to be flowing outward from the center, but actually undergone radical change after what happens in the colonies?
Yeah, I mean, look, the whole book is in one sense about that. But one thing I wanted to do, kind of polemically speaking, in the book, is to dislodge the idea that I think we still have in some form or the other, that all great ideas come from the West, and then they get appropriated by the colonies and then given a kind of a localized form. And of course, that's true in many ways. I mean, the West held power, and the West had the power to influence in a way in which the colonies did not. But equally, and we know that raw materials and profits flowed from the colonies to the metropole. And I wanted to argue that it is not the case that the colonies didn't influence the metropole. By metropole, I mean the mother country, Britain, but also, and in particular, that ideas from the colonies did make their way to the metropolitan center. And of course, there's many different aspects where we can study this reversing. But I wanted to look specifically at the ways in which resistance to empire acted as a form of tutelage, giving British dissidents in particular a much better understanding of how ideas moved in the world and how ideas could shape history. The Jamaica instance is an instance of a clash of ideas. Now, the West's idea of freedom, which I think is still very much with us, is, or rather the West's dominant idea of freedom is one where you are free to embrace capitalism, and therefore you are free to sell your wage labor and you are free to buy commodities. That is the kind of really rather limited definition of freedom that we have still in the present day. The Rebels of Jamaica, there was an uprising in Jamaica in 1865 that has come to be known as the Morant Bay Uprising, and that also created a huge controversy back in Britain. The rebels of Jamaica, it turned out, were rebelling not because they wanted to embrace a Western idea of freedom or a British idea of freedom, but because they were explicitly rejecting mercantile economy. They were explicitly rejecting the idea that having now been freed from slavery, their only option was to work as wage laborers on the plantations where they had once served as slaves. They had a radically different understanding of freedom. They wanted no part of wage labor. They wanted no part of the plantation economy. They wanted small plots of land which they could farm on their own and live sustainably. In a sense, live in a way that was self-reliant and did not involve working for a rich white man. And that kind of clash of freedoms, my argument is that that is what underlies the huge controversy that the Morant Bay Rebellion caused back in Britain.
Because I think the very idea of emancipation, which happened roughly about 30 years before this Morant Bay incident, was something that was read as freeing the slaves.
Yes.
Right. And of course, what followed the emancipation in 1938, wasn't it? 1938 yes. was, of course, replacing the slaves with indentured laborers.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so you had another kind of free labor replacing the earlier slaves. And
yes, I mean, it wasn't free, but it was, conditions were not that different from slavery.
Yeah. And you also spoke about, a little while earlier, you also spoke about decolonization. And in the book, also, you seem to be not very happy with the emphasis on you write that in post-colonial studies, there has been too much emphasis on the post rather than anti-colonialism. And your idea of decolonization, because you have also, in a way, led a campaign for the decolonization of curriculum, which reminds us of what Ngugi did in the 60s. So what is your idea of decolonization, particularly of curriculum?
How much time do you have? I should say, first of all, that I don't particularly regard myself as leading a campaign on decolonization. I think it's important to note two things here, that the decolonize the curriculum as we know it, the most recent call, comes again, as with Ngugi and his colleagues, it comes to us from Africa. It comes to us from South Africa and the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the decolonizing the curriculum impetus that was put in motion by students at the University of Cape Town and then other South African universities. And then our students at Cambridge picked it up. I mean, I have not myself been much more than a facilitator. On the question of decolonizing, I believe that anti-colonialism was much more at its heart than simply getting rid of foreign rule and replacing it by nationalist rule. The most expansive thinkers of anti-colonialism had radical visions of post-colonial societies, which would be, egalitarian, embrace a different understanding of freedom, weren't simply just kind of mimicking capitalism and Western values in any simple sense, was not, in a sense, retrenching into racialized or religious identities, but actually more inclusive, more dynamic visions of what a national community might look like. And these visions were never just about nation or nationalism. They were very much about alliances across borders. I mean, you think of the moment of Bandung, and you think about the interest then in Afro-Asian alliances, of understanding that while you might have an independent nation, you didn't just stop at the borders. And I think that we have really largely lost that. We have largely lost an expansive vision of decolonization. We have lost the tenets of anti-colonialism, which were not simply about kicking out foreigners and then grabbing the spoils for yourself. What we have in India, for instance, now is not really decolonization. We just have racist white rule replaced by majoritarian Hindu rule. And that is not decolonization. That is a form of mimicry. And so therefore it really, in a sense, it is the tragedy of our times that India, along with many other post-colonial contexts, has failed to decolonize, and in many ways is embracing some of the most regressive tenets of colonization.
About the curriculum part.
Yes.
You were
about the curriculum part, that depends on where you are. In Britain, decolonizing the curriculum is often interpreted as simply just diversifying it, right? So taking your curriculum with Jane Austen, Shakespeare, and Dickens, and then sticking on a little bit of Achebe and, say, Salman Rushdie. Diversity has its place, but I think that decolonization is, again, asking for something rather more challenging. It is asking everybody, and that includes white students and non-white students, to think about the ways in which the colonial, particularly the European colonial project over 300-400 years, has shaped our very understanding of knowledge, has shaped our very sense of ourselves, has shaped our understanding of history, has shaped our relationships to each other. And it's really asking for a very fundamental rethinking of what knowledge itself is and who gets to produce knowledge. And that's, I think, a little bit more complicated than tinkering with reading lists.
Yeah, and another interesting idea in your book is about what you say about historiography, that it is not the suppressions in historiography, but rather the silences. So how does that concept of silences in historiography affect our understanding of history? What kind of silences?
Yes, that's not my idea, of course. That's partly coming from the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolph-Trouillot, who made a very important point in his book called Silencing the Past, where he says, you know, it's not about just actively suppressing or censoring. Of course, that also exists. It's about the fact that at the very moment that we write history, certain silences creep in. They creep into our writing of history, and there are certain things that simply don't get talked about. And in his work and in my book, I was interested in the idea of the agency of the colonized, the agency of the enslaved, the agency of Black people and the non-Western world in contributing to the making of the world, but also, of course, specifically in my case, the agency involved in resisting oppression, the agency involved in resisting the empire specifically. So I still think that we write histories where we don't actually look at the resistance of the oppressed. Even when we are talking about oppression, which we do need to talk about, we don't actually think about the world from the standpoint of those who are resisting structures of oppression. And I think that that is a very important silence that needs to be undone persistently in our understanding of history.
And you also write about how certain important events are turned into non-events, and therefore we don't even talk about them.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of Trouillot, for instance, he talks about how the most important revolution really was the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And this is a revolution that put into place the world's first multiracial, non-slave society. And yet, when we study, when we study outside the West, we hear about the French Revolution, the British Revolution, the American Revolution, maybe about the Russian Revolution, but almost no one talks about the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is the mother of all anti-colonial revolutions, and how many of us talk about it?
Yeah, I think last couple of questions. One is, you were talking about how young British students or general public do not know really much about the multiple strands in their own history. And similarly, I suppose the younger generation or even the older generation, even in the colonies, do not really know the various stands in their past. So, in a way, what do we hope to gain by a more nuanced and a more comprehensive understanding of the past? I mean, is it anger that we want? Is it or what recently Shashi Tharoor talked about, reparation? Is it is it shame that we want, or is it restitution? What exactly do we hope to get out of that?
And you're asking me this question specifically in relation to colonialism.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not a great believer in shame or guilt or any of those, kind of quasi-confessional emotions. I don't think that, I always tell my students that that is really not the point of engaging with the difficult aspects of history. There are certainly situations in which reparations should be talked about, particularly, and this is much more so than perhaps in the case of South Asia, the decimated colonies, the decimated slave colonies, which really, let's face it, Western capitalism, and indeed capitalism as we know it, was founded on the free labor extracted at gunpoint of millions of Black people. And these are communities that are still poor and still struggle with the legacies of having been slaves who were never compensated. I mean, we have the astonishing fact that the slave owners were compensated in addition to being given indentured labor as a kind of practically free labor pool. But those who actually were enslaved and whose labor contributed to the making of British capitalism, including British banks that are still functional, they have never been compensated historically. So reparations, yes. And I think the Indian case is a little bit more complicated, but I want to say one other thing in relation to Tharoor and the Indian case. It may be that some form of reparations is called for in the Indian case as well. After all, entire industries were decimated. There were, terrifying famines which, set economies back. But one thing I've always said is that decolonization is a two-way street. So the very moment at which you look at somebody else's oppression upon your nation or community and you demand reparations, that is the moment at which you ask yourself, what about the oppressions and extractions my community has been involved in? What historical wrong, what historical forms of oppression and exploitation still shape my country and my nation? So therefore, if we talk about reparation from Britain to India, then I'm afraid we are obliged to talk about what forms of reparations might be in order from the Indian upper castes, the Indian feudals, people who have been in power for centuries and have also been complicit in extraction and oppression. And I'm not saying this as a whatabout. It's a genuine question. Reparations are in order, but then that will also invite us to radically rethink what our societies look like. But the short answer to your question is this: what drives this is not anger, shame, or even simply reparations, but a vision of justice. Justice is what must drive our kind of vision of reparative history and actual material reparations.
And acknowledging and accepting it?
Absolutely. It's the very first step, and no society that doesn't acknowledge what it has been part of is going to progress. After all, we spend a lot of time being so-called proud of this, that, or the other in our past. Then I think we have to spend just as much time being critical of what wasn't worthy of pride.
And what we are made of.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I think the last very question is, how does our understanding of the past also help us understand what is happening today? For example, our understanding of the empire, how does it help us understand, let us say, the American interventionist policy or the Brexit in Britain? So how does an understanding of the empire and its processes help us understand or make sense of what is happening today?
I think, again, one can go on about this, but the short answer is that a lot of what empire put into place is still very much with us. So the idea that you intervene somewhere to bring freedom or bring prosperity, that's a colonial idea. The idea that you intervene somewhere militarily in order to emancipate women, that's a colonial idea. Certainly Brexit has been very reliant on the idea of British exceptionalism and Britain's special destiny, and also, of course, Britain's so-called special relationship with the Commonwealth. So certainly Brexit, American interventionism, NATO, militarization, corporations are all part of the structures of empire, which are still very much with us. I mean, we know, for instance, that the East India Company, as Nick Robbins says, was the world's first multinational corporation. And today we still have multinational corporations behaving in ways in which the East India Company would be very familiar with. But the flip side of this is, again, this, that post-colonial states must also ask how the empire and the legacies of the empire shaped their behavior. I mean, we are looking at states which are, outside the West, also using colonial justifications for their endeavors, whether that is China or India. Sometimes the state puts forward logic that is startlingly colonial. And frankly, if we look across South Asia, the fact that none of the South Asian nations have really divested themselves of a colonial penal code just tells us all there is to know. We are still governed by the actual literal laws that the British Empire put in place.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bandung spirit. And you also talked about how that kind of a larger vision of transnational alliances has more or less disappeared. But there are also very, I was some time ago, I was reading about Sarojini Naidu's family, and the way Virendranath, moved around was amazing. I mean, from Britain to France to Germany to Russia, and that entire league against imperialism. In your book, you write about the Ghadar movement, but in Britain itself, did Britain in any way, because you mentioned how within the British society there were people who were opposed to the empire, did they kind of facilitate the anti-imperial movements within Britain?
These people, oh yes. So the League Against Imperialism did have a British contingent, and in fact it had one of the most active chapters after the League more or less kind of started to dissolve at the beginning of the 1930s. The British chapter of the League Against Imperialism continued right up until the Second World War. So it was a very, very active chapter led by another very interesting figure known as Reginald Bridgman, and Saklatwala till he dies in the mid-1930s was also a part of the League Against Imperialism. And in the late 1940s, 1950s, that formation morphs into something called the Movement for Colonial Freedom, which was very involved with the whole Mau Mau controversy. And then eventually the Movement for Colonial Freedom in the 70s and 80s becomes an organization known as Liberation, which was involved in anti-apartheid activism in Britain. So there are these very interesting genealogies that take us, from the beginning of the 20th century well into its last years.
Okay, now let me see if I can quickly run through a few questions. The first question that I can see is Prafulla Chandrasekhar, and he asks, was East India Company encouraged to spread its political strength in India by the Queen? And he also asks a second question, was the play Indigo Planters or Neel Darpan had any impact on the British? That's a
sadly, Neel Darpan had very little impact. And it's a play that actually very few Indians even really know about. It was a very important moment, and the Indigo Rebellion was registered, but it didn't really have the kind of influence that that 1857 would end up happening. I believe there was a translation of Neel Darpan.
There is.
There is.
Yes.
But I'm not aware of it having any real impact or readership in Britain. I think the translation had a kind of fairly limited circulation. But I'm not a scholar of the Indigo Rebellion, and it may be that there are hidden archives that tell us more. I'm not entirely sure what the first question is asking. I mean, certainly the East India Company were facilitated by the Crown. On the other hand, of course, not least due to concern in Parliament, most famously articulated by Edmund Burke, 1857 brings about the end of diarchy, where the Crown and the East India Company are dually responsible for rule in India, and the company is essentially removed from its powerful position, and Crown rule is imposed. So that's all I can kind of say about that relation.
Since you mentioned Edmund Burke, there are two questions about very familiar figures. Giridhar Rao asks, what a fascinating cast of characters. Was Kipling a point of reference in the critique of the 20th century dissidents? And a related question is about, this is Atul Nair, who asks, talking of British dissidents, what about critics of the empire like George Orwell or Leonard Woolf?
Yeah, okay, let's start with the second question first. I mention in the book that I'm not really looking at Woolf and Orwell.
Yes.
Partly because I don't really consider either, I know this might be heresy, anti-colonial or consistent critics of empire in quite the same way as some of the other characters that I look at. Woolf belonged to the kind of Bloomsbury formation, which, as Mulk Raj Anand tells us, was largely silent on colonial questions. With Woolf, Woolf was a member of a kind of little pressure group within the Labour Party known as the Labour Party Advisory Committee on Imperial Questions. And I looked at some of their archives, and they have kind of very genteel discussions about, well, this or that reform, or this or that is a little bit going too far. It's a very genteel, very mildly critical, I would say. Certainly, I would not call either Woolf or other members of that committee consistent anti-colonialists or consistent critics of empire. Orwell has his moment, and there are certainly essays which speak to an anti-colonial, and I do touch on him in one of the chapters. So he is there, but I don't think he really fits into the cast of characters who are much more consistent and also much more involved in alliances and activism around the question of empire. One of the things about Orwell that I find quite interesting is one of the essays that is presented as evidence of his anti-colonialism tends to be Shooting an Elephant. But if you look at Shooting an Elephant, it's not actually anti-colonial as such. It's really saying that the position of the white administrator in colonial contexts is untenable. It's a very difficult position to occupy, and my God, this is a terrible situation which we need to get out of very soon. It's not particularly interested in the point of view of the colonized. It's not particularly engaging with the question of resistance. He does write very interesting pieces later, one of which is called Not Counting the N-Word. And there, I think you see much more of a sense of his growing anti-colonialism. And I argue in the book that in part, that is because he's starting to engage with people like George Padmore and C.L.R. James, and he's being actively influenced by them. So he does have a walk-on part in the book.
And about Kipling?
Yes, about Kipling. Kipling is often mentioned in passing as a kind of classic example of bombastic imperialism and the kind of thing that British people need to not be. So he gets a kind of honorable mention in occasional pieces attacking imperial discourse within Britain itself. So the recessional and the kind of imperial poetry is often alluded to in passing.
Nagula Suresh asks, what is your take on internal colonialism in India?
What is my, well, I thought I had kind of spelled
I think
it
you
out.
mentioned that.
Yeah,
You
I
did.
mean, just to say that, first of all, the question of, the word internal colonialism is, I think, controversial for good and for bad reasons.
Yeah.
The question, of course, is whether we accept the definition of the internal in the first place. That said, let me repeat what I said a few minutes ago. There is a great danger that post-colonial states have not only not questioned the state apparatus which they received from the empire, they have failed to change the structures of rule, that they use the same discourses, use the same methods of repression, the same military strength. I certainly think that there is a great danger that the former colonies, whether that's Brazil, different history, of course, not a British colony, and whether that's India, whether that's South Africa, there is a danger that former colonies start to behave much like those who colonized them.
And do you also see it as a problem that if we start using, the very word colonialism, whether internal or external, to every situation, are we in danger of dehistoricizing that particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen some references to, for instance, the Babri Masjid as an example of colonialism, and therefore the demolition of the Babri Masjid as being equivalent to pulling down the statues of slave traders in Britain. And that is just a completely untenable, ahistorical, and improper comparison, because the history of what happens in India prior to British rule is not some kind of simple form of colonialism. Of course, there's conquest, and of course, there's oppression enacted by multiple kings and kingdoms. But colonialism is a very specific form of rule, and we need to be attentive to those specificities.
Ramakrishna asks, as the insurgent ideology is part of people who are forcibly ruled by some other larger group, empire, nation, or another ethnic group, what made you restrict yourself to the insurgent ideology only to empire?
Oh, just because I wanted to write a kind of counter history of empire. In relation specifically to that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the implications of that question is there are multiple insurgent histories to be written, and they should be written.
Yeah. And one more question is again, Atul Nair. Would you, like scholars like Vinay Dharwadkar, etc., consider the phenomenon of Indian English literature as a counter critique to the British narrative and an example of dissent?
I think some can be. It's like any set of novels, any literature. Some are dissident, others are not. I mean, literature is rife with the potential to be dissident. And in my second book, the Indian novel, the Indian English novel, I do talk about some works, many works perhaps, that are dissident, and dissident not just about the empire, but dissident about things like gender, sexuality, caste, and so on. But you can't particularly come up with a formula for the novel, I think, or for literature. There are dissident works and there are quiescent works. And I think it really depends.
Yeah. I think that's the questions that we have. There is just one more comment. I don't know exactly whether this is a question or not. Krishnendu Chaudhary says, I have a small point. Meghnad Badkabya by Michael Madhusudan Dutt was greatly influenced by colonial literature. Well, all literature initially was influenced by colonial literature, and the very point that you made here and earlier in your book on the Indian novel is it's not just being influenced by colonial literature, but how it was also modified, according to the local conditions. whether it is the Indian novel or not. Thank you, Priya. I think, I must now tell our audience that Dr. Priyamvada Gopal was not feeling well, and she specifically said she would like to restrict this session to an hour because she has had a bad health. And so thank you once again very much, Priya.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time. And once again, congratulations on this wonderful book. I know it has been creating quite a lot of.
This is the Indian edition, by the way, Simon and Schuster.
Yes, yes, it's already available now. And earlier, of course, it was brought out by Verso, and now it is available in Indian edition. Thank you once again. And with this, I bid farewell to our audience by making one announcement once again. This is about our next session, which will be in 15 days' time. We'll have a conversation with Sherry Simon on her book, Translation Sites, a Field Guide. This will be on the 21st of August at 7 p.m. And we'll be broadcasting it live on YouTube. And so please do subscribe to our channel and also click on the bell icon so that you get a notification that every time we have a session there. So I hope to see you all. And once again, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues at HLF, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinara Murthy, I thank you, Priya, once again for taking your time, and get well soon. And
thank you.
All the best.
And you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.